Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Escaping the Housing Trap by Chuck Marohn and Daniel Herriges. I'll talk very briefly about the authors, go over what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Chuck Marohn and Daniel Herriges are both members of an organization called Strong Towns, and they are very much interested in housing and addressing the housing crisis as they see it. At the beginning of the book, they talk about how the housing crisis means different things to different people. But at this time in history, it means one of two things: that there's not enough housing for the people who need it in the United States. This is a very US centric book, so if you're an international listener, this is maybe not the best book for you because a lot of it is very, very US centric. But it basically looks at the housing crisis in the United States, meaning either housing is very, very unaffordable for many, many people, or there are too many people who are unhoused, who can't even get into basic housing. And what I liked about this book was it is done in very plain language. I know Chuck Marohn because I've listened to his Strong Towns podcast and his Upzone podcast for about a year. This book came out, I think, in April 2024. So a lot of the information in it were things that I had heard before. But I think the book does a really excellent job of giving you a very straightforward look at a lot of these ideas in very, very plain language. This is, I think, the third book in a series, and it's called Escaping the Housing Trap because the housing trap in some ways is the housing in the United States is something of a dichotomy. We need housing prices to rise because for most Americans, the single biggest asset they have is their home. And once you've paid off what is typically a 30-year mortgage, sometimes a 15-year mortgage, you begin to build equity in your home, meaning your home appreciates in value without you having to pay more money into it. And when you retire, many people will sell their homes, take the equity from the home, the difference between the price of the home and what they've paid for it. And if that house has appreciated in value, they can then use that to some ways provide for their retirement. They can downsize, they can move to a smaller unit, and they have a little bit of a nest egg to live usually their golden years. At the same time, we need housing prices to fall because in many places of the country, the housing market has become unaffordable and people are paying huge sums of money to essentially live in terms of their incomes versus the housing prices for apartments or mortgages. They do a very good job bringing in statistics and showing what percentage of people are paying at least 30% of their monthly income towards housing. In some places, people are paying up to 50% of their income towards housing, and how that's really unsustainable long term. So I really did appreciate those stats. They do a good job of going through this idea of the suburban cycle of build, decline, escape. They look at the housing boom that occurred after the Second World War and how the federal government, subsidized a lot of suburban expansion, and how the expansion goes through this similar cycle where people move into a brand new subdivision in the suburbs. There's an amount of maintenance costs that are associated with maintaining the roads, the water, the utilities, and over time, the maintenance cost becomes deferred because the taxpayers typically do not pay taxes enough to cover the cost of maintaining these things. And then over time, there is decline as the taxes rise in order to meet those ongoing obligations. People pull up stakes and just move to a newer subdivision or suburb, and you see this kind of cycle repeat itself again and again and again. There's a caveat there that I'll go into a little bit in the cons that he doesn't really cover, but I think that general pattern holds very true. I reviewed a book a couple of months ago that had a similar cycle that I'll try to leave because now the name of the book is escaping me, but I'll leave that below. That kind of also talked about this kind of cycle of decline. Moving into a new subdivision, enjoying the subdivision for about 20 years. When the maintenance costs kind of catch up to the subdivision, the taxes don't cover the subdivision enough to pay for the maintenance. When those taxes rise, people leave for lower tax base, and that kind of goes again and again and again. He covers kind of the post-World War II kind of push towards home ownership as part of the GI Bill and other expansion during the 50s and 60s. Really a good job of that. And I think this just overall, the book is a very good primer for anybody who is looking to understand kind of how the housing market interacts, and it's kind of a series of different systems and people. And I think the book does a really good job of explaining the financialization of that, and how the financialization really pushes people towards one of two options as far as land developers and builders. They have this shoe metaphor that I thought was really interesting that he goes back to a couple times to kind of explain why that we have what a lot of people have called the missing middle of housing. So these are really starter homes for people to move into, or maybe more non-conforming is maybe not the best term, but apartment complexes that are less common in certain areas, and why those apartment complexes are not as common, and the zoning laws that come into that. He does a good job at the end. They do a good job at the end of the book of looking at some places where there have been steps that have been taken in order to build up this missing middle. They use South Bend, Indiana as an example of a place where there's local development local developers are trying to look at building zoning codes and finding ways to reduce things like parking requirements, which is a big impediment to building more what they call infill. So it's trying to take a neighborhood, if there are empty lots, to build on those empty lots other units that may not be single family homes, but give people housing. And so the book is really pushing to think about ways for us to build more housing, and how do we do that faster. He touches on NIMBYism and YIMBYism. They touch on NIMBYism and YIMBYism, and I thought that was maybe one of the weaker parts, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But NIMBYism is not in my backyard. YIMBYism is yes in my backyard. And towards the end of the book, they have kind of a series of, they don't have really policy. I wouldn't say they have no policy recommendations, but they're pretty light on the policy recommendations. They have certain principles. And one of the principles is to try to limit the amount of change in a neighborhood, rapid change. They really push the idea of trying to find ways to go from a complicated system to what they call a complex system, which is to take an existing neighborhood with the principle that we need more housing, but people should still be able to recognize their neighborhood 5 years from now and 10 years from now. You get into a lot of subjectivity in that, and that's kind of one of the downsides I thought of the book. But the idea that they push for is, and they use a term that now again I'm blanking on, but the idea is to try to go one level, to increase density within neighborhoods by basically one level. So if you have a neighborhood that is fully single-family homes, detached single-family homes, start looking into building more duplexes and cottages, so backyard units. They don't really like the term in-law suites, but having in-law suites that are being allowed, triplexes if you have duplexes, 5/1s, and so trying to find ways to increase density within the housing. And they go into some of the struggles of building, what we would call tiny homes. They basically call it, everywhere else you'd call them starter homes. But the difficulties in doing that, and how the financialization of that makes those things kind of difficult, and what cities and local governments can do in order to help out with some of those things. This book was not as heavy on the financialization. I got the sense that the first book in the series is really more of how we got here. I really highly recommend the podcast for anybody who hasn't read Upzoned, who hasn't listened to Upzoned especially. That's a really, really fun podcast. And if you haven't thought about housing density and deferred maintenance and all these things that are really not super exciting topics, but I think are really important for how people live their lives, I would highly, highly recommend that. I think that his whole perspective on cities and how we can improve cities and make them different and better, I think there's a lot there. I think that a lot of the deferred maintenance and stuff is going to, if it's not really corrected, start to become a bigger problem politically in the next 5 to 10 years, as we have more and more of these suburbs kind of aging out, and you're going to have these pockets of really dead zones, economically speaking, if people keep pulling stakes and leaving. So the one part of it there's a couple things that I didn't like. There's some chapters that just kind of end abruptly, and I wish there was maybe a little bit smoother transition on some of these things. There doesn't seem to be any kind of future focus on some of this. So when he's talking about deferred maintenance, there's never really a consideration of what happens if we're able to build with better materials and new techniques to kind of increase the lifespan of anything. So there wasn't really an abundance mentality of any of these things. and how that could possibly change. And so I felt that there was a little bit of an extra layer of desperation on that, and there didn't seem to be any possibility of improving the lived experience as we go through building a new cycle of homes. Is it possible we build with better materials on the roads to decrease the maintenance costs going forward, and how would that change the outlook of things? So that isn't really considered. I felt that the NIMBYism chapter is kind of the chapter that I kind of felt the most at odds with, because I felt he didn't fully really come to an answer that really satisfied me. I felt that, and part of this is the idea when he talks about people pulling up stakes and leaving. Well, there are some people there are many people who would, if you're looking at purely financial stakes, if you're looking at everything from purely financial standpoint, then yes, you're going to have this cycle where you have a build. Over time, the suburb declines and the maintenance costs increase, and so people pull up stakes and leave. Well, that's true if people don't continue to put effort into their community, and people don't choose to live there. Even though you're having a higher tax bill, they may have reasons that are beyond the purely financial that cause them to stay, and that also is not really considered in a way that I thought was pretty glaring omission. And then the NIMBYism. So he points to, there's a woman in California who runs an organization whose name escapes me, but it's Marohn County, and this woman has run this organization for years and years and years, and tried to stop development in her area. I think it's townhouses that she's trying to oppose, because she doesn't feel that it fits the image that she has of the area, which is a common thing. You see this not only in California, but other places as well. There's a book called The Neighborhood That Never Changes that kind of touches on these things too. You have people who are invested in what they see as the essential characteristics of a neighborhood. Could be if you're in an area that historically has townhouses, that you oppose the building of 5/1s because you find them to be aesthetically unpleasing. The same thing is true if you have an area of single-family detached homes. You really don't like duplexes because you find them aesthetically unpleasing. So this woman has fought this for years and years and years. They did an upzoned episode, other podcast about her, and he touches on this in the book. And my issue with that was, at one point he kind of recommends having this decision done at the state level as far as what is allowed, and then to me that's like, well, how much control should someone at the local level have? And he kind of comes to the decision that, or the opinion that, everybody should basically go one step higher than they're going. So if you have mostly single detached homes, there should be, without really an argument, we should be able to go up to duplexes. And I still think you have to have some way to have an interaction with that person who's just dead set against that idea. And I don't know how you do it. I don't think he does a really good job of explaining to you, well, here's how you would handle this person in this organization that is dead set against increasing density in this neighborhood. And maybe it's as simple as there is no answer. There's no way to really talk them into that. But I felt he kind of gave up halfway through that argument, and I wish that he had fought a little bit harder to kind of explain what to do with someone who is really dead set against them, that, and try to understand where they're coming from. Part of that is Prop 13, and I think it's Proposition 13 in California, which basically states that someone's tax base on their home is relatively low. This is a proposition that they enacted in the 1970s that keeps their price point low for their taxes. And I think there's this idea that if you allow additional development in the area, it's going to harm homeowners of the area. And I don't think he really wrestles with that fully, of how do you talk to someone who just is dead set against people building more in the neighborhood, if that is going to change the aesthetics of the neighborhood or the feel of the neighborhood. This goes back to the, like, how quick of change is too much change, how fast is too fast for change in the neighborhood. And that's a very subjective thing, and he doesn't really wrestle with it too much, other than to say we should go at least 1 degree higher than what we're going, but we shouldn't go more than that very quickly. So there's one other thing that I'm kind of blanking on of what else I was going to mention, because it comes towards the end of the book that I had a problem with. But for the most part, I felt this was a really excellent primer for someone who wants to learn about the housing market in the United States and kind of the issues we're in. Like I said, this is the 3rd book of the series, so you may want to start at the 1st book. The 2nd book is about engineering and how, I haven't read any of the other books, but based on the Upzone, the 1st book is probably more focused on the financialization, because this is something he talks about on Upzone all the time, of how the the finance market and the mortgage-backed security really is kind of the unsung villain, uncritiqued villain. I'm not sure what the opposite of unsung would be, but it's the invisible villain of all these things, because the mortgage-backed security led to this idea of what he calls the shoe metaphor, where there are two types of housing that we feel really comfortable building, and everything else we're a lot less comfortable building. And he shows how that historically we were in the past much more comfortable with building all this other types of housing. People were much more comfortable with borders, with shorter term housing that we knew was not going to be permanent, but we were much more comfortable with that in order to get people into housing, and how the building codes and all those things have kind of eliminated a lot of that for good and for ill. So I really, really enjoyed this book. I would highly recommend it to anybody who wants to get into the nuts and the bolts of it. Sometimes if you're a layperson, it can get a little bit technical, and there's a lot of information in the book. So maybe I would recommend kind of taking it in smaller chunks than I did. I got right through because a lot of the stuff I'd heard before. But overall, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a really good primer on a lot of these things. And if you're interested at all in this, really to the point where you're going to do something about it, I also found it to be really interesting because he does show examples of communities who are doing it the way that he would recommend, which is whatever your community is, think about ways that you can have more infill housing and look at really some of the barriers that are leading to less housing being available for more people. So would really recommend it. I would reading for next time. The Bill of Obligations is going to be what I'm reading next time. Until next time, please feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Thank you for watching. Until next time, bye.